I made another guitar. My son recently started taking guitar lessons, so I decided to build him his very own guitar so that he would stop stealing mine. He actually requested an ocean pattern on his guitar, so I had to enlist the help of a friend to help me get this done. I think that this is my favorite build to date, and I hope that you guys enjoy watching. But before we get started, huge thank you to this week's sponsor, Woodcraft, where I wouldn't be able to do what I do without them, so please go check them out down below. And now let's begin the build. I started by cutting up some ash to rough length at the miter saw. I'm going to glue up 2 of these pieces to make the body, and I don't have a jointer to clean up the rough edges, so I used my tapering jig as a jointer jig at the table saw to make 2 square edges for gluing. Then I glued them up to make one big blink. Normally I have shop sounds in the background in my videos, but I forgot to plug in the mic for a couple days. Oops. So while that dries, let me just take you through the design process a bit. I knew I wanted a single bridge pickup like a Les Paul Jr., so I found an image of a Les Paul Jr. online, brought it into a program called Inkscape, then I traced around the shape of the Les Paul and played around with the curves until I was happy with the look. I printed out the paper template and taped all the pages together, then cut it out so that I could trace it onto a piece of MDF that I will use as the actual template for the guitar. Warning for this video, guitar building is all about templates, so this is just the first of many for this build. I cut out the MDF template on the bandsaw and stayed just shy of the line so that I could clean it up with the sander after. The reason why I decided to make a template on MDF instead of just cutting out the shape on the ash blank is that it's way easier to do all the final shaping and sanding on MDF than it is to shape and sand a thick piece of wood. And if I want to make more guitars in the future, I'll have a template ready to go. So once the body blank was dry, I used the MDF template to trace out the shape using the center of the glue up as my center line. Then I roughly cut out the shape with a jigsaw. I had to use a long blade here since this blank was about 1 3/4 inches thick, and I just went slow, staying close to the line, but not on it. For the tight curves, I made some relief cuts, and then I was able to easily follow the curves. Awesome. All right. Heads up, double-sided tape was my best friend on this build, so I loaded up the MDF template with a double-sided tape, centered it on the body, and brought it over to the router table with a flush trim bit to clean up all those jigsaw cuts. If you saw my last bar cart video, you may recall the tear-out fiasco I had using the straight flush trim bit, so I decided to upgrade and get this monster compression flush trim bit, and it was amazing. The grain is running in all different directions because of those curves, and I didn't experience any tear-out at all. I'm so happy I decided to upgrade. So the next step is to route for the control cavity. I used the paper template I printed out before as a guide and used a Forstner bit that has the same radius as the cavity, and then I marked out where to drill those holes, then drilled them out at the drill press. Then I connected those 2 holes with a jigsaw. I could have just sanded the inside of that cavity to make it flush and smooth, but instead I enlisted my best friend, double-sided tape, and a straight edge to perfectly flush up the cavity with a pattern bit in my trim router. I repeated the same thing on the other side, and then I had a perfect template for this control cavity. All right, sound is back. All right, so the next template is for the pickup. I decided to go with a P90 because it's one of the easiest pickups to install. I used the P90 cover to set the fence at the table saw, then cut a piece of MDF to that thickness, and then cut that piece in half. I sandwiched the cover plate between some more pieces of MDF and temporarily taped that all up. Technically, I could have just used this as my template on the actual guitar, but I figured that I might want to build more guitars with this pickup, so I used this temporary setup to make a sturdier template I can use on future builds. The only problem is that the 1/2 inch radius of the pattern bit that I have is too big for the round corners of the pickup. So I used a 1/4 inch bit in my router and used the smooth shank as a bearing of sorts to make a 1/4 inch radius in the corners to fit this pickup. Now the pickup fits perfectly and everything's ready to be routed out. I flipped the body and the template over so that I can mark out the control cavity, then brought it over to the drill press to hog out most of the material, making sure to get rid of all of those pointy parts so that it's safer to use the router to clean it all up. I double stick taped the template to the body and used a pattern bit to start cleaning up the hole. When I couldn't lower the bit anymore, I took the template off and used the area that I previously cut to ride the bearing on. I marked on the outside how deep I needed to route this out and just kept going until I got to that depth. I left probably around 3/16 to 1/4 inch of material on the top. Next is the control cavity cover. I made this template the exact same way that I made the control cavity template, only it's slightly bigger. I used double-sided tape again and eyeballed it so that it was even all around the control cavity, and the 1/4 inch shank pattern bit for my trim router is too long to make this cut. I could have doubled up the template. Instead, I whipped out my big router because I have a 1/2 inch shank pattern bit that's shorter and perfect for this job. I set the depth of the cut using a scrap of MDF and the pickguard material I'll use for the cover plate, and then I plunged to that depth and route away. This was the perfect fit, and I was surprised how all of this was way easier than I thought it would be. Next up is the pickup cavity. I used the paper template to mark the distance for this pickup. I got these measurements from the original Les Paul Jr. image that I based this off of. After making sure the lines were perpendicular, I traced out the pickup cavity template and drilled out most of the material again at the drill press. Then basically repeated the same process with the router, only this time I had to use the shank on the 1/4 inch bit to make those corners have a smaller radius that matches the pickup. Alternatively, if you're good with hand tools, you can use some carving tools to get the perfect radius on those corners as well. Next up, the neck pocket. I decided to purchase a neck for this build. This is a Gibson replacement neck that I found on Amazon, and it has an angle already built into the tenon. So I'll have to route out the neck pocket first and then create the angle on the body to match the tenon. This was the most nerve-wracking part of this build so far. So I took some scrap MDF and placed them on the body using double-sided tape so that they were nice and snug next to the neck tenon, then repeated all the same steps as before. Hog out at the drill press, clean up with a pattern bit in the router, and just keep going till it was the perfect depth. Now, the hard part, the neck break angle. The angle on the neck was about 4 degrees, so I used my tapering jig to cut 2 pieces of MDF at that same angle. Then I attached those 2 angled pieces to each other with more scraps, making sure that this whole jig was wide enough for the body to fit in and under. Then I double-side taped this jig to my bench and clamped the body down. To use this jig, I made a long base for my trim router out of a scrap piece of plywood so the router can ride along the angled sides, creating the neck break angle of the body. I just kept taking super shallow passes until the bit reached the front of the neck pocket. I was so happy with how well this actually worked. So moving on, I needed to drill a hole to connect the pickup cavity to the control cavity. Since I was drilling this from the top and couldn't see where I was drilling towards, I traced the control cavity template on the top just as a guide for drilling with this crazy long bit. So I really did not like this step at all, and the hole was super close to the top of the cut. It's totally something I'm going to need to work on for the next build. I was about to drill the hole for the output jack next, and then I realized that if I used a roundover bit, the bearing would slide into that hole, messing up the roundover. So I did all of the shaping first. I used a roundover bit on both sides of the body, and then I used my Strat as a reference for where to carve out the contours for your arm and belly to make it more comfortable to play. I started shaping this with a Shinto Rasp, and then I remembered I have an angle grinder with a flap disc that would make this go a lot quicker. I just shaped away with the angle grinder and kept checking to see if the contours were comfortable. This was really fun to do, but I'm so happy I decided to do this outside because this would have made a huge mess in my shop. Once I got the rough shape I was after, I refined it more with my hand sander and of course listened to some good tunes while refining the shape by hand. Can you name that tune?
Best thing that you ever had. Best thing that you ever had.
Shaping is done, so now I needed to ask my son what kind of design he wanted on the guitar. Hey dude.
What's up, Mom?
If you could have any design on a guitar, what would it be?
I like to swim in the ocean a lot, so maybe the ocean?
The ocean.
That seems nice.
All right. Let's see if I can figure that out.
Really?
I needed to use a lifeline for this one, so I phoned a friend. Here comes Sam to the rescue. Sam is the one-woman show behind DIY Huntress and has an awesome YouTube channel, which I'll link to down below. I saw Sam do these really cool ocean pours on her Instagram, so I knew she was the perfect person to help me out with this. We just needed to discuss for a while exactly where this pour would go, and after a bit of discussion, we were ready to go.
Got it. Okay. Oh my god, I'm so scared. guitar and resin gods.
Yeah.
If there's a guitar and resin god out there, like, please bless this project. Ready?
Guys, it's happening. It's happening.
Okay.
So we were both super excited and nervous to do this. I spent a good amount of time working on this body, so it would really stink if doing the pour would completely ruin it. But I had total faith in Sam that she could get this done, and that she did. If you want to see a more in-depth tutorial on how to create this ocean effect, check out her video that I'll link down below. Since she's more of the expert on this stuff, her video will show you exactly how to get this look, so definitely check it out. To get a deeper look, we had to do 2 pours. You can't see on camera, but there's like a crowd of people around Sam watching her as she worked, and my husband's face was hysterical. It looked like this emoji. Look at his face. This was such a fun process to watch, so huge thank you to Sam for executing this and for being the entertainment for my kids on a Sunday. So after letting the pour cure overnight, Sam suggested that I use a heat gun or a hair dryer to help soften up the epoxy a bit when removing the tape. And that worked out really great. The tape came off super easy and the edge was really clean. We were both nervous that the epoxy pooled into the pickup cavity and that I would have to route it out to clean it up, but thankfully nothing got in there thanks to Sam's pro taping job. I was so scared for the rest of the steps, I really didn't want to mess up the ocean. For the pots, I decided to go with a pre-wired harness so that I had a minimal amount of soldering to do, or soldering for my friends across the pond. I used the holder for this harness as a template for where to drill the holes for the pots. I'm so scared to do this. If I mess it up, Sam, I'm really sorry. Okay. I was so nervous that the epoxy was gonna crack. I just drilled slowly and it was all good and it didn't blow up. So now I could drill a hole for the output jack that goes into the control cavity. This is a 7/8 inch hole or 22 millimeters. Before finishing, I just needed to smooth out the edge of the epoxy pour. I used a razor blade held at a slight angle just to shave away at the edge until it felt like there was like a smooth transition to the wood. All right, on to the finishing. I decided to go with a Tru-oil Finish. This is a tung oil based finish and I've used it in the past and loved it. All you have to do is keep pouring it on and rubbing it in until the grain stops soaking it up. You can leave it matte like I did, or you can build up multiple coats and then buff it out so that it's a super high gloss shine. It's a really cool finish. I set that off to dry and worked on the neck for a bit. The Gibson scroll headstock wasn't working for me for this build, so I cut it off at the bandsaw and then refined it at the benchtop sander, and then I added my little personal touch, a water slide decal with my logo on it. I'll put out a separate video on how to do this next week if you're interested, so let me know down below. All right, almost at the finish line here. I glued the neck into the body, wiped away any of the excess glue and squeeze out, and I left it to cure inside in clamps overnight. While that was drying, I worked on making the cover plate out of the pickguard material. I cut it out at the bandsaw and then shaped it at the sander until it was the perfect fit. I also made an audio jack plate cover out of the same material and drilled for all the mounting holes. The next day, I could take the clamp off and install the bridge and tailpiece. To do this, I used a straight edge along the neck and brought those lines all the way down. Then I marked for the bridge 24 3/4 inches down from the nut because this fretboard has a Gibson scale length. After bringing that bridge line across, I measured 1/8 of an inch down from the base side and drew an angled line across. Then I made another line about 1 3/4 inches away from the bridge line for the tailpiece. The bridge will be at an angle to accommodate for the thicker strings on the base side. To mark out the holes for drilling, I used a brad point bit that fit into the holes and pressed down, then brought the body to the drill press and drilled them out. At this point, I needed to drill a hole from the control cavity to the tailpiece to ground the bridge. Not poke through the top. It sounds easy enough, right? I drilled through the top. All right, attempt number 2. All right, attempt number 2. Oh, I did it. Oh my God. I did it. That was the worst thing ever. This is where I went through the top. Oh, that was so awful. All right, I'll just have to fill some of that in with epoxy. Kind of looks like a bug hole. This is ash, so ash is prone to having that. So not the end of the world. Wish it didn't happen though. All right, Going to put some ground wire in here before I bang in the tailpiece bushings. That was so frustrating. So I did a ton of research and kept seeing that you don't need to solder the ground wire to the bushing. They just need to be touching, so you could just place the wire in the hole and bang the bushing into place on top of the wire. So that's what I did. I banged in the second bushing, then clipped on the tailpiece. And in order to get the correct location for the bridge, I put 2 of the tuning pegs in place and temporarily installed 2 of the strings, so that I can place the bridge on my angled line that I drew out before, but making sure that the strings are perfectly centered on the fretboard. I marked out for the holes with the brad point bit, drilled them out at the drill press, then banged the bushings into place. A wooden mallet was the perfect tool for this job. Time to get all these electronics into place and wired up. I decided not to shield the cavity with copper foil because I wasn't sure if it was necessary. If I do find that the amp is picking up any interference, I will just shield it. It's always something that I can do after the fact. I'm not going to go into the details on how to solder because I'm really not great at it. But I soldered the pickup and the ground wire to the pots, and now it's time to finish off all the final details. I put in the jack plate cover I made earlier, screwed it in, and I screwed in the pickup, screwed in the tuning pegs, screwed on the control cavity cover, put on the bridge and tailpiece, put on the knobs, and installed the strap buttons. Now, I strung up the guitar and it was not playable. The neck needed some work. I made a notch straight edge so that I could adjust the truss rod and make the fretboard flat. Then I spent a good couple of hours doing a fret job on this. I was expecting to do this since I only paid $60 for the neck. I still think it was a great deal. Once I got the fretboard all set up, I made a custom truss rod cover from the pickguard material, screwed it on, and it's finally time to string it up. All right, I cannot get over this. This is the coolest looking thing that I've ever seen. I cannot believe that I made this. So first of all, huge thank you to Sam for coming out and doing this ocean pour. This is exactly what I had pictured in my head. You are awesome, Sam. Definitely go check her out down below. She is an amazing woodworker and DIYer. So as far as the build goes, I don't think I would do anything differently if I were to build another guitar with the same simple setup like this. I think that the only thing that I would do differently next time is probably make my own neck. So I didn't make a neck for this because this one was $60 and I figured I could just do a fret job on it and it would be okay. And it is okay, but I think the only problem with it is the neck angle. So it had an angle already built into it. And I think that that angle might have just been a little bit too steep because when I set everything up, I had to raise the bridge just a little bit too high, and that makes the action height just a little bit too high as well. So correct me if I'm wrong, luthiers down below, but I believe that if my neck angle wasn't as steep, then I would be able to lower the bridge a little bit, and then that would make my action height just slightly lower and more comfortable to play. So I made it work, and I set up all the intonation and everything. But I think that that's what I would do differently next time. I did not build a neck for this because I know how my son treats his things. So I did not want to put all that time and energy into that. But if I'm going to make one for myself next time, I will totally make the neck. So I am so excited about this. I cannot wait to surprise my son. But before we do that, huge thank you to this week's sponsor, Woodcraft, where I cannot do what I do without them. And a huge way to support me is to support my sponsors. So go check out that link down below and you can get some stuff to make your own DIY guitars as well. So let's go surprise him. 1, 2, 3, turn around.
An oven. Whoa! It's sick.
What does it look like?
The ocean?
What kind of design did you ask for?
The ocean?
You have to share that with me because that's too cool.
Thanks, Mom.
Well, it sounds good. It's the beach, it's awesome. So what do you got, like, there's no controls, I guess this is just the tone?
Volume, yeah.
Sounds great. We're going forever.
I can listen to this forever.
Awesome. I'm inspired by this guitar.